Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
My. I'm Po' Boy Rice, and I'm an alcoholic. Hey, y'all. Sober today by the grace of God, fellowshipping with men and women just like you, and because our program works. I'm a member of the Glen Haven Stone Mountain group over in Stone Mountain, Georgia. My sobriety date is December the 12th in 73. Now, that may not impress some of you folks out there, but it just tickled the hell out of my kinfolks. I want to take this opportunity to thank the committee and all you wonderful people for letting me be over here in Arizona in this Roundup. It's dark. I can't see all y'all out there. I think it's a little bit fair that I tell you in the beginning that I'm kind of old-fashioned and I'm kind of countrified. And you never would have known that if I hadn't told you. Anytime I'm in a big crowd of folks like this, I think maybe there might be somebody there that knew me before I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I want to tell you a little story. And it's about an old friend of mine who lived over in North Carolina, Virginia, and he stole a man's milk cow. And they gave him 12 months in a chain gang. And when he finished his sentence, he was so ashamed of himself until they moved down in Georgia, and he got him a job, and he went to work. And he established such a good record in the community, and he started attending a little old Baptist church down the road, and he established such a good record in the church until after a while they made him a deacon in the church. And he served in that capacity for some time, and the preacher resigned one day about something, and they asked this old buddy of mine if he would be their preacher until they could get one. And he accepted. And on the first Sunday morning he walked up in the pulpit to deliver his sermon. He looked down the aisle and he saw a long-legged joker come walking in that he used to be in the chain gang with. And he started his talk off something like this. Now, brothers and sisters, I came here this morning fully prepared to preach to you from the book of John. But after observing this great congregation, I have changed my text to the second chapter of Jude, where it said, if you knows anything or if you sees anything that ain't already leaked out, you keep your mouth shut till this meeting's over with. Well, thank God we can laugh. I love to laugh. And I love to see other people laugh. But when I laugh, I have to remember that one day I cried. How about you? Yes, Lord. You know, laughter is some of the best medicine I believe I have ever found anywhere. Just a good old belly laugh that'll help you digest them turnip greens. You know, I did quite a bit of research before I found out there ain't no second chapter of Jude. But it worked. I never did say nothing about it. That book that says Alcoholics Anonymous on the front of it says that our story is disclosed in a general way. What we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like today. And I just love to talk about what it's like today. But in order to do that, I'll have to talk about a few other things that's not too easy for me to talk about. But this is part of what I'm up here for. I was born a little over 75 years ago over in Rockdale County, Georgia. And my old daddy was a moonshiner and a sharecropper. And we lived on a big plantation. And everybody that lived on that plantation was sharecroppers and moonshiners, or you didn't live on that plantation. And I think we were about some of the poorest folks there was in Rockdale County. I think by the time I was about 10 years old, I could operate a liquor still as good as my old daddy could. I knew all the ingredients that went into a batch of beer that would cause it to ferment and when it was ready to be distilled. So I learned all that as a little old barefooted boy working around a liquor still. And I don't know just how old I was when my old daddy moved us to Atlanta. And they moved us into a part of the city that was a real slummy area then as it is today. And they called it Cabbage Town. And I think everybody that lived on the street we lived on was a produce peddler or a bootlegger. And every little old boy that I began to associate with was a graduate from some reform school or he was a candidate for some reform school. If he hadn't been, he was on his way. And of course, we all know what it's like to be young at some time or another. You know, we just like to be accepted by the people that we're so closely associated with. And I'm no different from anybody else. I wanted to be accepted. And I began to do the things these other boys did. And I remember some of these kids' dad would buy them a bicycle, and my old daddy was so poor he couldn't buy me one, and I'd steal one. And a little bit later on, some of these kids' dad would buy them an old hot rod, and my dad couldn't buy one, and I'd steal one. So I always had just as much as the rest of the kids, but mine was all hot. Now, they don't do this over in Georgia today, but they did then. And this was back in March of 1929. And I was 16 years old. And they had me up in the courthouse because I found out the law was frowning on some of them things I was doing. And I never will forget what that judge told my mother. He said, I'm going to send your boy to a chain gang and let him see what it's like out there, and then I'm going to turn him right back out, and I'm sure that your boy will be a better boy. And, of course, we would believe anything anybody told us, especially the judge. And so I went off to the chain gang, and I expected to get out that night or the next morning. That's what the judge said. But it didn't quite work that way. They kept me 4 years. And so here once again, a mixing and mingling with the people that I was so closely associated with, I had become a real smart aleck. Now I got another name for that, and I guess you have too. I hated everything that stood for law and order, honesty, decency, and respectability. And that's what I was like when I came back out on the streets 4 years later. And I drank liquor day and night. I couldn't tell you how old I was when I had my first drink of liquor. I was probably in diapers. And my whole family drank liquor, and everybody we knew drank liquor, and we didn't see nothing wrong with it. Just a few days after being released from the chain gang camp in a drunken stupor, on the outskirts of Atlanta one night, I wrecked an old automobile and I killed my mother. And I never got over that for a lot of years and a long ways down the road. And I could hear Mama crying and pleading and begging, trying to get me to slow that car down, and I wouldn't do it. I was a smart aleck, and I lost my mother. And then I began to run with some of the worst people in this country. And a short time later, I was arrested, tried, and convicted, and sentenced to serve over 100 years. And so back to the chain gang I went. And my only hopes of ever being on the streets again was to run out. And it seemed like I just run all my life. I escaped, or I attempted to escape from every institution I was confined in, except the last one. Most of those men that I was so closely associated with are not around today. Some of them were shot down and killed trying to escape. Some of them were shot down and killed out on the highways of the street by the policemen. And some of them went to the electric chair. So my friend, just by God's amazing grace, that old po' boy stands up here this evening and tries to share a little of my experience, strength, and hope with you. This was back in the days when they used the old sweat boxes and the stocks as punishment over in Georgia. And those old sweat boxes was made like a coffin. It stood up on its end. And you backed up into it, and they'd close that door right up against your face, and they'd bore a hole there for you to breathe through. And you couldn't sit down, and you couldn't turn around. And I've stood in those old boxes till my feet would swell up and bust my shoestrings. And those old stocks that you would hang up in by your wrist and your ankles. And for several years after those things were abolished in Georgia, the back of my hands were paralyzed. And they whipped me with everything imaginable, and I continued to get worse because we don't win people like that. Sometime today, folks will say, "Po' boy, how do you win them?" And I'll be glad to tell you there's a little old four-letter word that says L-O-V-E, love. Thank God for this kind of love I'm talking about. And I've seen it move men that you couldn't move with a Thompson submachine gun. Eventually, the federal government built a place over in Tatnall County we call Reedsville, and that's one of our state penitentiaries over there today. And I was one of the first convicts to enter that new prison in October 1937. And they locked me in a little cell for 8 months until they could open up a rock quarry for incorrigibles. And I was transferred over there, and I remained over there 3 years. But I managed to escape on 2 different occasions. And they transferred me back to the big house under what they call a stop order, never to be transferred out again. And a short time later, we got a new warden down there. And out of 2,500 convicts, he picked 10 of us with the worst escape records. And he said, "Carry these men to maximum security. They'll never come back to population as long as I'm warden." And we had a lot of friends, and we had a lot of connections. And 30 days later, we escaped from maximum security. And we came downstairs, and we captured the whole inside of the penitentiary. Now, that's never happened before, and it's never happened since then, but it happened then. We'd taken over the front office, the powerhouse, the switchboard, and I walked down through those cell blocks with a market basket full of keys, and I turned everybody out that said they wanted to run away. And so I turned 100 out. And we threw that main switch, and we had a complete blackout. All the inside lights, tower lights, everything went out at one time. And 25 of us went out those big front doors, and we took cars off the yard and escaped. Within another 30 days' time, we was all back in jail somewhere, with the exception of one little old 17-year-old boy, and he got drowned in the river that night. The other 75 that I turned out went down and broke into the commissary and got all that juicy fruit chewing gum and brown mule chewing tobacco. They didn't want to run away. They're just full of larceny and wanted to steal something. And the governor offered a $1,000 reward, dead or alive, for every one of us. They started what they called an 8-ball squad. Our heads were shaven, and those old pick irons were welded around our legs, and we were placed out in a stump digging detail. And every state trooper in the state of Georgia would have to come down there 10 at a time and stay 10 days guard duty over this detail that they might know these men anywhere on sight. We was not allowed any mail privilege. We were not allowed any visitors, no lights in our cell. Life looked pretty hopeless in those days. So many of these men began to break their legs and to break their arms and to cut their heel tendons, the heel string. And some of them crippled themselves for life. And the word leaked out up to the Capitol as how these men was crippling themselves. And the governor picked a group of men to come to Reedsville to investigate this thing and recommend something to do about it. He picked the president of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, a lot of judges, probation officers, newspaper reporters, and photographers, and one other man I'll never forget as long as I live. His name was Mr. Wiley Moore. And Mr. Moore was a millionaire banker in Atlanta. And the governor asked Mr. Moore to head up this group and said, the state of Georgia will back you people up 100% in any recommendation you make. And so they came to Reedsville, and we were driven out of those old muddy river bottoms into that old dark cell house. And Mr. Moore said, open the door, I want to go in here and talk to these men. And they said, you can't go in there because it's too dangerous. And this was the first time in my life I ever heard anybody talk about God in a respectful manner. Mr. Moore talked about the God of his understanding, and he was not afraid. And they opened the door, and he came in, and we followed him to the rear of this old cell house, and we sat down in a big circle. And Mr. Moore sat down in the center of this group with tears just flowing down his face, and he brought us a message. He talked about the God of his understanding. He said, you can't buy it, it's not for sale. And the most amazing thing of all, he said, you don't have to be good to get it. It is a gift, you just accept it. And I could not, for the life of me, understand that kind of talk. But I had all the respect in the world for that man. That man was for real, and he was not afraid. He said, I'm going to take those old chains and stripes off of you. I'm going to let your hair grow out so you'll look like a human being. He said, I'm going to let you pick any job in this institution that you want, that you might learn a trade that'll be worthwhile to you one day on the streets. He said, I don't care how many life sentences you're serving. If any man in this detail would just do 5 years with a good record, I guarantee you a parole. What an opportunity. There was only one man in that detail that taken advantage of that opportunity, and he's the only one, as far as I know, that's still living today. He did do 5 years. He was paroled. He's an old grandpa now. But you know what kind of job I asked for? I asked for a job down in the stewards department. That's where they got all that meal and sugar and syrup and yeast. Well, I think we're going to identify him directly. You know, in the joint, they call that stuff buck. It ain't nothing but old still beer. And I learned all about that stuff from my old daddy, working around the liquor still. And I can assure you I drank alcoholically for many years in the penitentiary. Sometimes the folks say, "Poor boy, how you getting in there?" "Honey, it's easier to get in there than it would be here in Flagstaff. You don't have to walk as far after." During the next few years, there was a lot of things that happened. A lot of them were tragedies, and it wouldn't help me or you either one if I talked about that. But there was a lot of humor along the way, and I like to look at the humor side of life. Now, most everybody had a nickname. They called me Po' Boy. And I had a little old buddy there that weighed about 75 pounds, soaking wet. And he had a nickname. They called him Hitler. And if there was anybody in the penitentiary that loved that old buck as good as I did, it was old Hitler. And I remember one morning I'd pulled off a batch of beer, and Hitler, he got drunk. And he got out there in the hallway, and he got arrested on a plain drunk charge. And they had old Hitler down at the control office, and the warden said, "Hitler, where'd you get that buck at?" And he bowed over real humbly, and he said, "Captain, you can just whoop this old head of mine till it rattles like a pot of okra if you want to. And I ain't going to say one word against my good friend Po' Boy Rice." Now, old Hitler, he swore he didn't snitch on me. But then, as many other times, we'd have to go upstairs and eat bread and water for a few days. That's the way I was doing time. But I used this little extra privilege I had of mixing and mingling with the other convicts and scheming and plotting and planning. And after a while, I got me an old pistol smuggled in there. And I got up one morning there, and I was so insane drunk, I didn't know I was in this world hardly. And I enticed 5 of those other convicts to help me. And we captured 19 of them free people and had them all tied up in hay wire, using them as hostage and trying to go out the back gate with them. Now, I thought I wanted out bad, but I can tell you folks this evening, thank God I didn't get through those gates that morning. I wouldn't have been living today. And anything that I tell you that happened to me, don't you feel sorry for Po' Boy. I asked for every bit of it. You know, I was in this fellowship for quite a while before I realized and accepted the fact that I am responsible for my actions. Those people didn't do it to me, I did it to myself. And so they stripped me off naked, and I was beaten till I was bloody as a hog, and I went to the death house. And there I remained for the next 2.5 years in the shadow of the Georgia electric chair for safekeeping. Now, they don't use that thing too often over in Georgia today, but during those years, the state of Georgia was leading the nation in executions. And I had a ringside seat. This did not make a Christian out of me, but it certainly did change my attitude about a lot of things. Two and a half years later, I came back to population, and I had a thought like this. Now, when I go again, I'll go out that front door a free man, or I'll go out that back gate in a pine box. I surrender. I can't beat you. And in my way of thinking, for the next 7 years, I made what I called a good record. Now, I stayed drunk most of the time, but I stopped trying to escape. And by this time, we had a pardon and a parole board in Georgia. We never had one before. We had a prison commission, which consisted of 3 men. They were the whole works in Georgia. And every year they would come down there and interview me and make a recording of my attitude and carry it back up there and play it. And they did that for 7 years. And one day they came down there, the chairman of the board, and he said, "Po' Boy, we think you might have been in long enough, but you've been too closely confined for too many years to be turned out with the public." I didn't know anything about World War II, and I had no trade. And I didn't understand it then, but I know today those people knew more about me than I did about myself. He said, we're going to recommend that they send you out to a road camp and let you mix and mingle with the people out there. And when you get used to being around folks again, then we're going to give you a parole. And so they shipped me out to a road camp, and they told my kin folks that we're going to set him up there on trial. And if he'll stay up there and do good for a year, then we're going to parole him. And I felt like a misdemeanor then. I'd count them months off, weeks off, and days off, and that year was up. And they sent me a big long envelope and said, stay another year. And that like to broke my heart. I couldn't understand that kind of stuff. I found out later on they did that for psychological reasons, to see if I could stand a little disappointment. My attitude was, when Sunday comes and my kinfolks come out here, I'm going to get what little money they got and I'm going to leave, because I could have left real easy then. But all these years that I'd been gone, my little old brothers and sisters had grown up and they had all become church people. And I never could understand why they didn't talk to me about God. I guess they thought I was just a hopeless case. And I was so bitter at the state of Georgia, and I wanted them to feel the same way I did. And they just dropped their head and began to cry, and I didn't know how to fight anything like that. My sister says to me, I know you don't have a God, but I do. And she said, there's a lot of folks praying for you that you don't even know. Don't louse this thing up. Let me go back up to the Capitol again. I like to look at it this way, all the way down through life, at different times and different incidents. There were some little seeds that were planted. Mr. Moore planted a seed down there in that old cell house that morning. And my sister planted another seed out there that morning. And these little seeds that were planted along the way, eventually they began to sprout and come towards your surface, until one day, thank God, they blossomed out in a program called Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's all I know. That's all I know. And that's all I need to know. Everything that I know today that's beneficial to my way of life, my sobriety, I all got it in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm very grateful for this. The very next day when I came in from work, they said, "Po boy, you stay in tomorrow. Somebody's going to carry you up to the Capitol again." And so they carried me up there. And there was a lot of people up there representing me. I didn't even know them, just friends of my family. And they said, "Well, we're going to reconsider and we'll let you know what our final decision is in about 2 weeks." And about 2 weeks later, I was paroled. I'd been in 20 years, 1 month, and 2 weeks. And when you made parole back in those days, somebody would have to come and pick you up and carry you home and bring you some clothes to wear. And I never will forget, my sister brought me a pair of slacks and a sports shirt. And that was the first time in my life I'd ever owned a pair of pants with a zipper on them. Now, honey, that really turned me on. I'd catch myself standing in front of the mirror going zip, zip, zip. Of all these modern inventions. And that's what I was like when I came home. And I went to live with my sister. And every time the doors of the church were open, my people all went. And it was kind of a take it or leave it proposition. Now, you can stay here by yourself or you can go with us. And so out of curiosity, I started going to church. I went for all the wrong reasons. I met a lot of wonderful people up there, people who wanted to help me. But I kept everybody at a distance. I wouldn't let people get close to me, and I refused that help. But there was one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life was going to that church. I met a little lady there, and Virginia knows her, and her name was Flo. And 30 days later, Flo and I got married. We rented some furnished rooms, And there was two men in that church got me a job digging ditches for a plumbing company. I'm a good ditch digger. And I went to digging ditches, and me and Flo would go to meeting on Sunday, and I wasn't drinking liquor during this time. And after a while, they gave me a dime raise and made me a plumber's helper. And I stayed with that until I could get one of those little old cards that said that I was a journeyman plumber. And so I went out to Emory University, and I went to work as a plumber, and I worked out there 2 years, and I didn't drink liquor. And one morning they called me in the office and said, "Po boy, we hate to do this, but said this is a big thing in DeKalb County. There's a lot of folks that knows you. Home, everything they had to get me out on the streets. Walk the streets, drink liquor, feel sorry for po boy, and I run again." Well, I went to another state that time. I got in there about 2 o'clock in the morning, riding a Greyhound bus, drunk and crazy. Got off of that bus, couldn't find nobody to talk to. Everything closed up. And walking up the street, I saw those neon lights flashing, fancy wines and liquor. I said, "Oh, here's one." Sure enough it was, but it's closed too. And I stood there in front of that liquor store, that big plate glass window come all the way across the front. And those shelves came right up to the front, and they had half a pints and fifths and quarts. The insanity of alcoholism, and I hauled off and I hit that glass with my hand. And it fell out all over me and all over the sidewalk, and I cut my hand, and I didn't know I was cut. And I just stood there and filled my pockets full of them bottles. And walking on up the street, my pocket was full of blood. My shirt and my tie was bloody, fishing for a cigarette. And the police run up there and throw the shotgun on me and carried me back down there. And I lied like a dog. I said I didn't do that. He said, "Man, how in the world are you going to deny something like this?" I said, "I don't know, but I am, and I did." That next morning, there was a city detective was trying to question me, and I was about to go into convulsions, and he was scared I was going to die on him. He said, "I'm going to do something for you, and you better not tell nobody." He went back there, and he got a glass of liquor that high. Boy, that was a good drink. Probably saved my life. They kept me in that Hamilton County jail over there for 5 weeks, and the grand jury met, and they failed to indict me. They called me downstairs one evening about dark. It was raining in the wintertime, and opened the door and said, "Get," and I got. I thought they'd made a mistake, and I run 5 blocks just as hard as I could till I give out. I said, "Them folks ain't all that crazy. I'm the one that's crazy." You know, I didn't know for a lot of years till I was on a meeting over in Maryville, Tennessee. And I got to talking to a judge over there. You know, we got some of them in the program, too. And I was telling him about this, and he was from that city. And he said, "Po boy, that old boy that gave you that drink of liquor was a member of this fellowship." And said, "He is the man that went before the grand jury and said that man has surely got to be an alcoholic. And if you will just turn him loose, he'll go back to Georgia, and we won't have to fool with him up here." It takes one to know one, don't it? And that's exactly what I did. I went back to Flo to get what money she had, walked the streets at night, feel sorry for po boy, and drank liquor. Well, about this time, there's no buddy of mine got out of the penitentiary. We'd run together for about 50 years. One evening, it was just about dark and raining. We were going up the expressway, and we had a flat tire, and we didn't have a spare. And right across the expressway was a filling station. So we went over there and bought a tire, and the man said, "Pull your car over here, and I'll put it on for you." So here's 2 drunks trying to get across that expressway, and there's a Thunderbird dealer and his family from up in Ohio was on the way to Florida on vacation, and they run over us and tore up our car. And like two good alcoholics, we jumped out and took theirs away from them. You know, that just looked like the normal thing to do right then. You done tore up my car, give me yours. That don't work too good either. So, you know, it wasn't so much as what we did, but because of our past. And they tried me and that old boy, and they gave us 20 more years apiece and sent us both back to the big house. And if I'd have had the nerve, I'd have cut my throat. I couldn't see no way to live 20 more years in there. I didn't know how to pray. Thank God Flo did, and I'm sure a lot of other people did. Because 14 months later, they transferred me up to Stone Mountain Park, near where I live today. They was building a new prison camp up there, and they sent me up there to put the plumbing in that new prison camp. And when we finished that new prison, the warden had us to install a little chapel out in one end of the mess hall. And he called me out on the front. He said, "Now, po' boy, I've got a different assignment for you every Sunday afternoon, because we're going to have a different church group from all over this area that'll be coming out here holding services." And he said, "I want you to stand by the door and welcome the visitors when they come in." He said, "I'm going to get some song books, and I want you to lead the singing." He said, "I want you to go back there in those bullpens and form a choir out of those convicts." He picked an ignorant, uneducated Georgia stump jumper like me to do something like that. And of all the dumb things, I wanted to do it. You know, our program tells us that half measures avail us nothing. I never did believe in straddling the fence. I've been believing that a long time. I believe in being what you are. And I wanted to do what he asked me to do, but I knew I wasn't in no shape to do that. But I think it was along about this time that something happened. I wasn't just sorry that I'd been caught up with. I was sorry for those things that I had done. And I call that a godly sorrow. I found me an altar, and it was an old black burnt hickory stump out in the woods. And I'll never forget it as long as I live, when I dropped down on my knees by that old black stump. And I said, "God, if there is a God, whoever you are and wherever you at, I give what's left old po' boy to you. I ain't gonna run no more. Lord, I'm so tired of that old ugly, dark, and negative side of life. I could stand here all night and I couldn't tell you what happened. But since that day, I've never wanted to rob, steal, or kill nobody since then. I want to share something very important with you." Thank you. He left me an alcoholic. And I hope I don't ever see the day when I think I'm cured, because I've already seen what happened to some folks who thought they got cured. And I'm sure you have too. You know, I went back in and I did what the warden asked me to do. I welcomed the visitors, and I led the singing, and I formed a choir, and the good Lord sent one of those honky-tonk piano players out there, and I put that joker to playing gospel music and formed a quartet. Oh, we turned it on, honey. Wasn't no half measures there. You ought to have heard some of my singing. It's kind of a cross between George Beverly Shea and Piano Red. But you know, my little old wife Flo could come out there and sit in those meetings on Sunday evening, and I still had that number on the seat of my britches, but I felt sort of like I was free. Something had happened. I look at it this way: this God that I talk about don't have to be in a great big hurry. He's always right on time. I did that for the next 5 years. And one morning somebody said, "Po boy, I just seen Flo go around the corner up there with your Sunday breeches, and it like scared me to death. I thought some of my kinfolks had died. Maybe I was going to the funeral." But that was not the case. Miss Rebecca Garrett was chairman of the Pardon and Parole Board. Maybe she still had a little faith in me, because somewhere between 6 and 7 years there, she decided to parole me again. And Flo had come to carry me home. We couldn't have hired a lawyer. We didn't have $1.50 between us. But somehow or another, we knew where our help come from. We didn't know hardly how to talk to each other, but we knew something. I went back to work at plumbing work for the next 3 years, and I didn't drink liquor. Then I got involved with a gospel singing group, and we moved around over the South, and I stayed real busy, and I didn't drink liquor. And then I took a job as maintenance man at a big hotel. And with all the conventions they had, Shell Oil Company and Standard Oil Company, and the liquor and the beer flowed real freely. I didn't know I was an alcoholic. I'd been out 6 years without drinking. And one day I decided I'd drink one of those good old cold Budweisers. I can take it or I can leave it. My friend, when you read in that textbook that this is a progressive illness and it always gets worse and it never gets better, please believe it. How do you know, po boy, from personal experience, which is the best teacher I've ever found in my life? And I got drunk, and I stayed down in the floor drunk for a solid year. Nobody knew what to do with me. Flo didn't know what to do. Somebody said, "Put him over in Peachtree Parkwood Hospital." And she did, and I went in there drunk and come out drunk. They had a little deal going around over there. They thought they could taper you off. They crazy and will. You know, every 2 hours around the clock, you could go up to the nurse's stand, and she'd give you 2 ounces of 100 proof alcohol and a little grapefruit juice. And you better believe every 2 hours around the clock, I was up at the nurse's station to get my medicine. So we spent what money we'd saved up, and the insurance was gone, and I'd have to go just wherever they'd take me, and I made the rounds. And I was in and out of those places so fast it's a wonder I hadn't died from exhaustion before I ever got to Alcoholics Anonymous. The last alcoholic hospital I was in was Georgia Mental Health. And I believe it had been the same old merry-go-round with the exception of one thing. On Monday night, they had an AA meeting out there. And they announced on that loudspeaker, said, "We got an AA meeting out in the lobby." And so once again, out of curiosity, I went out there to see what an AA meeting was. There's a very dear lady friend of mine who runs a rehab center over there in Georgia today. I was in that meeting, and she said that I looked more like a dead man than anybody she'd ever seen. And she came over to me after that meeting and said, "Po boy, do you want to get sober and stay sober?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I sure God do, but I don't know how. I can't do it. I've been running here and yonder to doctors, psychiatrists, and all these places, and I stay drunk." She said, "I'm not going to try to tell you how to do it, but I'll be glad to tell you how I did it." Now that got my attention. Here's somebody going to say, "I did it this way." She gave me her phone number, and that was the most important phone call I ever made in my life. When I left that hospital that morning, I called this lady. Her name was Sue. She got the little meeting book out. She looked up the closest meeting to where I was living at there in Stone Mountain. And she said, "They got a meeting over there tonight. Now you get yourself over there." And I went. Very suspicious, very skeptical, very doubtful. I didn't think anything was going to work. And I sat there in that meeting that night, and it was a discussion meeting. And those guys and gals would say, my name is so-and-so, and I'm an alcoholic. And I thought, my God, if that's what an alcoholic is, what in the world am I? Because to get from where I was to where I saw those people would have been a high step up for po' boy. And I made a decision that night. If that's what an alcoholic is, I wanted to be an alcoholic more than anything in the world. I didn't want to be po' boy Rice. Now, if I can just find out what these folks is doing, just maybe there's some hope for me. And I asked a real little old simple question, and I got a real simple little old answer. I said, what do I have to do to be like you folks? And they knew I was a fool, and they said, don't drink and go to meeting. If they'd have told me any more than that, I wouldn't know what they're talking about. And they know that. And so I didn't drink, and I went to meeting, and I hung on to them folks. And just to have someone to shake my hand when I come through that door and say, hi, po' boy, boy, that was good. That was good. And so I didn't drink, and I went to meeting. I'm the only man in my home group that they ever give a birthday party in 6 months. And nobody thought I'd stay sober a year, and I didn't either. You know, there was an old guy in my home group, and I just hated him. Every time he'd open his mouth, he'd say, the big book, the big book, the big book. And I didn't want to hear that. I wanted somebody to pat me on the back and say, you're doing good. Because I had got to where I'd got the wrinkles out of my belly and got to where I could eat. And I could lay down at night and go to sleep, and believe me, that was good. I'd get up in the morning, put my britches on, go to work. Don't drink, go to meeting. And I jumped on that cloud nine. Now, them old timers, they wanted to get me some kind of a job that would keep me coming regular. And the night that I had 6 months and picked up my 6 months chip, this old man that I hated so, his little old wife brought me a cake and said, po' boy, 6 months on it. And the group conscience had voted that you had to have 6 months sobriety to be secretary. And this was election night. Somebody said, I nominate po' boy. Somebody said, second that. Somebody said, I move it, the nomination be closed. Second that. You know how them little AA elections are now. And they said, po' boy, you are it. And I said, what? Said, you're our secretary. And I thought I owned my own group. And so for the next 6 months, I was secretary. And I'd go and I'd set up the meeting and I'd make coffee. And I'd tell people where they could sit and where they couldn't sit. I don't know how they stood it. But after a year, I celebrated a sure enough birthday. And I'd been watching them other people when they'd have a birthday party, and their wife would come up and give them the chip and give them a little sugar. And all that Saturday afternoon, I could just picture in my mind, Flo was going to give me my chip and a little sugar. And she was a real quiet person. She never would open her mouth in a meeting. And I just knew she'd sit down. She gave me my chip and gave me a little sugar, and she turned around to that microphone. And I thought they was going to have to call the fire department out there to get her to shut up. She told those people that we had a home, and we never had a home before. And that just tore my little speech all to pieces. And that's the way God wanted it. It was time for her to talk me shut up. But I lost that high office job as secretary and had to come down and be just a regular AA member, you know. Don't drink, go to meeting. And you know, about 6 months later, those meetings started getting boring. They started getting dull. And I become very critical of what these folks were talking about. And that come as near getting me drunk as anything that happened since I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. I knew that if I was going to stay sober, I was going to have to get into some action in this program. All this time I had been arguing about sponsorship. And I'd argued about a 4-step inventory and just fairly upset some meetings. But I decided I'd get me a sponsor, and guess who I asked to be my sponsor? That old boy that talked about the big book. I didn't like him. I didn't like him at all. But I knew that old boy would tell me the truth, and he didn't care whether I liked it or not. And I went to him and I asked him if he would consider being my sponsor. He said, "Po boy, I've already seen you celebrate a birthday. What makes you think you need a sponsor?" And I said something like I hear a lot of other people say, "Well, my program just ain't working too good right now." And he said, "Oh, yes it is. Your program's working real good. It was your program that got you to our program, and our program's called Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, if I'm going to be your sponsor, the first thing we're going to have to do is get rid of your little old program before you get drunk." Gosh, I didn't like that. He said, "Have you ever thought about a 4-step inventory?" And I said, "Yeah, but I don't know how to do that." He said, "I know it." He said, "Would you start on one if I'll show you what to look for in that big book?" He knew how to keep them props cut out from under me, and I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, it talks a lot there about resentments," and said, "First time I saw you, I knowed you was born mad." I started on the inventory, and he helped me. And after a while, I called him up one morning and I asked him, I said, I have finished my inventory. I want to do the 5th step. He said, "Run that and buy me again." I said, "I didn't finish my inventory." He said, "You got a 12 and 12? I said, "Yeah." He said, "Turn to page 50. And I looked and said, "A 4-step inventory, but the beginning of a lifetime practice." He said, "You through yet?" I said, "No." "Well, have you went as far as you know how to go?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Bring your inventory and come on over here." And me and Flo went over there, and Flo and his little wife, they stayed upstairs. He had that big book, and I had my inventory, and we went to the basement, and we shut the door. And we spent a lot of time down there. I began to share with him, and some of these things that wasn't easy to talk about, and he could sense that. Being a good experienced AA member, a man who had done a 5th step himself. And he could sense that, and he'd come in and share with me a little something that would help me to continue on. I laughed and I cried, and it just come pouring out. Picture in your mind, if you can, when I'd finished my 5th step according to my inventory, here's 2 big old ugly men standing up there hugging each other's neck. And it was the first time in my life I'd ever told another man I loved him. And I told him I loved him, and he told me he loved me. Gosh, I love sponsorship. Our book says, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. My friends, I had a spiritual conniption fit down there in that basement that day. And I won't never forget it. And you know, when we got into this making amends part, This old boy was an awful lot of help to me, because I know today, had it not been for him, I could have really loused up some things. You know, just since I became willing, with God's help, to try to live this program, there's been an awful lot of things that's happened. But I also found out, you know, that just because we don't drink liquor, that everything is going to be good, because that's not so. Things have always happened, and they always will. One of the best things that ever happened to me since I got to Alcoholics Anonymous and tried to live this life, I received something from the state of Georgia that don't many people ever get unless they can prove their innocence, and I couldn't do that. But after being on the streets for 13 years, I received a full, unconditional pardon from the state of Georgia. All right. First time I'd ever been free since I was a little boy. And I just bowed my head and I cried out of gratitude. Free at last, thank God, free at last. Back in June of '85, Flo and I came out of a conference one Sunday afternoon, and we got home, and the following weekend I was supposed to have been in Jackson, Mississippi for the convention, and we really hadn't unpacked. And on Tuesday morning, Flo and I was on our way to a meeting in a rehab center, and Flo had a stroke. And I put her in the Rockdale County Hospital, and they put her on one of those life support machines, and they kept her alive for 15 days, but I lost Flo. And that was the worst thing that ever happened in my life. Because in August, I was supposed to have been in the Southeastern Conference over in Louisville. And I said, I can't go, I can't talk. She's so much of my life. Some of you folks might know Joe Phelan. He's trustee over in the Southeastern region. And Joe told me, he said, yeah, you going, poor boy. You got to go. And I didn't want to go, but I went. But I could just picture in my mind, every time we'd be in a meeting and it'd come my time to talk, and Flo would say, honey, which one of them old suits you going to wear tonight? And I had two, and I'd say, I'm going to wear that old brown suit tonight. And Flo had an old brown slack suit. And she wanted to dress just like poor boy. And she'd put on the old brown slack suit, and she'd always sit right on the front row. And sometimes my knees would get wobbly, and I think I couldn't go on. But I could look down that Flo, and those big brown eyes was right on poor boy. She believed I could do it. And that would give me that little extra lift so that I could go ahead and share with those people. You know, I like to talk about experiences. I talk about personal experiences. And anytime I'm in a meeting, whether it's a big meeting or just a little bitty meeting, my mind and my heart is always centered on that new man, a new woman just coming through those doors of Alcoholics Anonymous. God help us that we don't forget these new people. Because remember, one day we came through those doors and we were skeptical and we were suspicious and we were doubtful, and somebody took us by the hand. Let's don't forget that, folks. Let's don't forget that. And so in wrapping this thing up, I want to share something with you that is based on personal experience, which is the best teacher that I've ever found in my life. And it's simply this: the problem that you have today, my friends, or the problem that may be further on down the road, it is never, never greater than this source of power that old po' boy stood up here and tried to share with you this evening. Thank you, God bless you, and I love you all.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control is connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right, but I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.